Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and man, do I have one for you today. I really want you guys to watch this one, watch it all the way through. I'm going to create a playlist at the end of this video. You'll see it pop up and in the description of my top 20 cases against Christianity, and this one's going to be in it. So what is today? Today we're doing a further examination of the differences between the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Old Law, the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, by getting hyper-specific and really zooming in on a concept that comes from both Jesus and Paul and every other pastor and preacher that has followed, and it is this. It's all about love. Love is the fulfillment. Love is the totality. Love is the summary of the law. And I just don't think that's true. In fact, I know it's not true, and I can prove it, and that's what we're going to do in today's video. We have 613 laws, as I mentioned, the mitzvot, from the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, and in them, we see maybe, I counted, I went through, if we're being generous, 16% that actually have to do with love. And that is the retconning of the Old Testament law. And by the way, retconning, short for retroactive continuity, where you change or alter previously established facts. Sometimes I think it gets misused. I think that it has a negative connotation that people like to utilize whenever they're criticizing something, but I think it really fits here. And to show that, we're going to go through the 613 commandments. Not all of them, but we're going to break them up into 7 groups, and we're going to show you how this does not fit. So without further ado, let's get to it. I want to start by laying the case with only 3 verses. Usually I use like 20 or 30 verses, but I have heard you all loud and clear, and I think I can make my case in 3. First is going to be from Jesus' mouth himself. This comes to us from Matthew 22, 36 through 40. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these 2 commandments. So we're going to see an escalation of this when we get to Paul. Jesus is saying, hey, here's numbers 1 and 2, and the rest hang on it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a summary or that it's a fulfillment, but it's also a little unclear, and Paul is going to fill in some of those gaps for us in the next 2 verses. And even if this is all we had was Jesus's word here, I think we could make the exact same case I'm going to, where we say, no, the others don't hang off of it. The other 611 are not propping up or building or being supported by these 2 concepts. It is not all about love. But the second verse I have for you comes from Romans 13, 8 through 10. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Now, we could have just taken this verse and made an entire video about it. He is really cherry picking which of the 613 he wants to talk about, but just in case we were to believe it's only supposed to be his version of the 10 commandments that he's referencing, he says, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. Now, he has left out love your God, which is the first and greatest command. He's saying the whole law can be summarized here as love your neighbor. And yeah, when you talk about the easy ones like you shall not murder or you shall not steal, you can say, yeah, that's loving your neighbor. What about all the ritual ones? What about all the purity ones? What about all the ones on sacrifice or dietary laws or circumcision? How are those loving your neighbor? But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the kind of thing we're going to look at here in this next part. But let me just lay it out simply in the last verse, Galatians 5:14. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself. And thus, we have our video for today. Is the entire law really fulfilled in this one command to love your neighbor as yourself? I don't think so. Well, so what, Brandon? Maybe Paul got carried away. Maybe he exaggerated. Well, that's going to lead to some issues when we trust Paul to help us understand the new covenant in general, when we rely on Paul to understand justification or sanctification or salvation or the importance of baptism, all of the things, all the church doctrine, everything we know essentially about salvation comes from Paul. So if he is clearly wrong or exaggeratory or retconning in any other case, I think it's very important to know. And I think we have ample evidence to suggest the issue here. What I've done is this for us to go through. I've grouped the 613 commands, and don't worry, we're not going to go through each of them, into 7 categories. Here they are really quick. We have ritual and ceremonial laws, dietary laws, civil and criminal laws, ethical and moral laws, family and sexual laws, agriculture and economic laws, and miscellaneous laws. I've seen other groupings. We could make this into 3 groupings. We could make it into 20 groupings, but I think this is fair for the goal that we're trying to work within today. And every once in a while, you'll see even say in the agricultural one that applies to loving your neighbor, like a prohibition of interest. This is a way of showing love to your neighbor. Sure. And I've tried to account for those. But the vast majority of laws that we could say fall under the love your neighbor section are going to come from the civil and criminal section or the ethical and moral section. That's only 150 commandments right there. And all of them, trust me, are not about loving your neighbor. And so what I arrived at was, again, if we're being so generous and not understanding how some of these actually work in the exact opposite, about 100 out of the 613 commandments have anything to do with loving your neighbor. 16%. I don't know about you, 16% to me does not make a summary. Let's go through these categories and really try to get a sense of what they are. Group 1 will be our ritual and ceremonial laws, and there's 185 of those. This is going to include things like sacrifices and offerings, priestly duties, temple service, festivals, Sabbath observance, and purification. I ask you, just in those 7 groupings, and we have multiple verses and commands for each, under this first category, how does that apply to loving your neighbor? It doesn't. Now, the best you can do here, I'm going to help you out, is say, well, don't forget about what Jesus said. The first command, the most important, is actually to love the Lord your God. Maybe these are how we show God love. Great. Let's stop right there. 3 things. First of all, it's not what Paul says. And we get a lot more about our modern day Christianity from Paul than we do Jesus. Paul is talking only about it being summarized by loving the neighbor. Second, if these are about loving God, then that tells us a lot about the nature of God, what God cares about, and why would that have changed? That's going to lead us to our third point, which is the original purpose of the law was to set God's favorite, his chosen people group, apart in what? In holiness. These people were to be more holy, more ethical, more moral than anyone around them. So those last 2 points I think are really interesting because, again, they both give us insight into God. What is he considered to be loved by? When you're pure, when you do the sacrifices correctly, when you observe the Sabbath correctly, when you do the right temple procedures. And what does he believe makes a people holy, more like him? Strict adherence to the letter of the law in these regards. It's not so easy at this point to just say, oh, it's all about love. Because again, here's 185 examples that have nothing to do with loving your neighbor. They have only to do with showcasing to us God's identity, what he cares about, what he considers holy, what's important to him, and it's stuff most of us would never ever consider even doing today. Don't you think that's problematic? That's exactly what I mean when I talk about the retconning of the Old Testament law. We're erasing what the God of all creation said 185 different ways are the correct, righteous, and holy things to do from a ritual or ceremonial purpose. I hope you guys can understand the point that I'm trying to make here. It is not so easy to just dismiss this God when you look closely at his commands. Make it more earthly if you need to. If your parents, whom you loved and respected and wanted to honor and love and obey, gave you 613 commands, would that be a good indication of what they cared about, of what they thought was valuable, of what they thought was beneficial, of what they thought was right? Of course it would be. Can you imagine then turning around saying, you know what? I think what these parents were really trying to make, and I'm not even going to ask their children, by the way, 1,000 years, 2,000 years later, I'm going to kind of make up my own version. I'm going to read this in the way that it was laid out, very clear, very factual, and I'm going to say, I think the heart of the issue here was just love. It is not fair to completely erase the nature of the lawgiver by so quickly dismissing and incorrectly summarizing the law. Let's give this God his credit. Let's see what he cares about. Read how pedantic these things are. Leviticus 1:3, if his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish. Why? Why so important for God to have the burning dead thing with the smell of singed flesh that is so pleasing to God be one that didn't have a blemish? Does it change the smell? I think what's going to happen here, if you're intellectually honest, as you'll read verses like this, and I think one of the greatest things you can do if you really wanted to know your God as a Christian is read the 613 commandments in their entirety. Find a list online from a biblical source that you trust and just read them. And remind yourself that this all-perfect, all-knowing, all-loving God that is outside of space and time, when he did choose to reveal himself to one group and only one group for one short period of time in history, had this one fleeting moment to help us really understand him by way of these 613 commands, and we get stuff like that. Or also contained in this first category, Leviticus 16:4, the priest shall wear linen clothing and linen undergarments next to his body. You got to have the right kind of underwear. That's what this God cares about if you're in a position of being more holy than even the rest of the holy chosen people. When it comes to temple service in Exodus 23:18, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread. Nope, we don't want the wrong kind of bread when we're performing blood magic rituals. That's right. The immutable God you serve and love and consider your best friend and personal savior is a God that commanded specific blood magic rituals, all the way down to which kind of bread to use. Imagine this. 613 laws, none of which, by the way, say don't molest children. But we hear over and over and over about what kind of food or linen are supposed to be used in different practices and at different times. Consider that. See the issue with that. Here's a purification one from Leviticus 15:25. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, she shall be unclean. This is what mattered to God. I don't care if it was for 1 second, even though it was for thousands of years. This represents God's interest and values, morality, justice. It's all wrapped up. If you lay out a finite number of laws, you get to be summed up by those laws. Tell me how I'm wrong. Well, Brandon, you're missing the point. Don't you also remember what Paul says? The reason that the law is given in the first place is to show man how sinful they are and how inept they are at ever being holy, thus why they need a scapegoat. Do you think that sounds better? Do you think that just made anything better? To me, that makes it so much worse. God has these ridiculous standards, and it's to show us how we don't measure up and thus require an even bigger human sacrifice. I don't think this does for you what you want it to do. I also think it's another bad summary of the law. But we spent a lot of time here. Let's move on to our second grouping, dietary laws. 30 commandments. Again, 0 about sexual abuse of minors, 30 on dietary laws. This is going to be things like clean and unclean animals, forbidden foods, blood, milk and meat, carcasses, fish, and insects. For instance, on insects, all winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you. Leviticus 11:20. Oh, thank you for letting me know, God. The winged insects, but yet walk on 4 legs, as God made them, by the way, those should be detestable to me. Check. 29 more to go. How about this one, which is actually in one of our 3 different versions of the 10 commandments, and that's Exodus 23:19. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Tell me how this reflects loving God, or tell me how this reflects loving your neighbor. It doesn't. And this isn't some metaphor to get us to some kind of hyper-truth. This is factually, literally meaning when you boil your young goats, just don't do it in its mother's milk. That's a law. And let me just pause and say, I almost could get on board. If this God, let's say he was limited, which is already a problem because he's all powerful. He doesn't need to morally progress man. And if he does, then why did that stop? Man didn't just get better. So the excuse makes no sense. But if this God were limited in power and he said, you know what? And also, I guess, limited in writing space on the tablets, I'm going to give you guys 40 things you really need to know. And they are going to be specific to you. And I am going to come back and change some of these things as we progress. And it's going to be multiple times. I could say, okay, pretty weird, but as a limited being, he's doing the best he can. But as soon as you make this God all powerful, as soon as you make him with perfect foreknowledge, knowing that he's going to have to bring Jesus to do this thing, which he doesn't have to, he's all powerful. His hands are not tide. But as soon as you start putting these other conditions on, and then you go back and you read the 613 commandments, it is simply silly. It's inexcusable. It's not important. It is, if we're honest, 100% not what you expect of a perfect God. It is, however, 100% what you would expect of an ancient people group that was obsessed and even trying to pass down beneficial ideas of what they had learned about unclean versus clean meat, and their misunderstanding of wet dreams and how to have holy men set apart by special linen underwear and these kinds of things. It's so very man-made. Now, it doesn't prove that this God didn't write these 613 commandments, but I think it's great evidence for the man-made nature of this thing, evidence against a perfect God of all love and justice and the arbiter of morality having a chance to give us good truth, and yet worrying about what kind of milk we're going to boil the goats in. Let's move on, though, to group 3, civil and criminal laws. Now we're cooking. There's 100 commandments here. And yes, I think many of these are going to help represent that idea about loving your neighbor. Like, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. This is great. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. Exodus 21:2. This is talking about indentured servitude. Not even, we can include in here one of these 613, Leviticus 25:44 through 46. You may go and buy slaves from the nations around you, owning them as property to pass down as inheritance to your offspring forever. See, there you have a civil and criminal law. That might actually fall under the ethical and moral laws. I'll have to check. Or you know what? It's probably under the agricultural and economic law because these people were just property. But there you have an example of something that does have to do with their neighbors, except it's horrendous. It's owning them as property for life. Maybe, just maybe, and this is a point that would be important, and if true, also changes the entire identity of the New Testament. When we're talking about neighbors, we mean fellow Israelites. Now, this is not true for what Paul is trying to say, because Paul considers himself the apostle to the Gentile. He is trying to include them. Was Jesus, though? Jesus says, don't think I've come for you. I've come for the lost sheep of the tribe of Israel. When God said neighbor, he meant fellow Israelite. I'll prove it to you in this next segment. So let's just move right on to ethical and moral laws. There's 50 of these. And the first one that I wrote down is love your neighbor. Look, it's right there. Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I hear this preached all the time to try to marry the New Testament idea with the Old Testament. And people even use it against me when I bring up the issues with slavery. They say, listen, how silly of you to say God hates foreigners or God doesn't care about Gentiles or that slavery is condoned in the Bible. Look at Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Let's do what Christians tell us we need to do and take it in context. And what do they normally tell you to do? Read 10 verses up, 10 verses down. What if we could stay within the exact same verse? Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. Neighbor here is clearly and 100% without excuse. There is no defense against this, meaning the people among you, other fellow Israelites, as are most of these. So if we scroll back up and we're talking about the laws for kidnapping, if a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the sons of Israel, he shall die. This is just a law for how to treat your fellow Israelite. So please, apostle of the Gentiles, take the Old Testament law in context and don't you dare try to convince all of Christianity to come that what God really meant by his 613 commandments was love your neighbor, and that neighbor was anyone. That neighbor was not anyone. And once again, Paul is retconning. And why is he retconning, by the way? You can put any personal motive you want in Paul. We could try to deconstruct what really happened on the road to Damascus. We can guess, because that's all we can do. But at the end of the day, Paul, for whatever reason or motive, had a mission to take Christianity and make it for the masses, to take what was once a Jewish religion for Jews only and apply it to everyone, while sprinkling in the Hellenistic Greco-Roman ideas of Stoicism and virtue ethics. And virtue ethics, by the way, being pretty much the complete opposite of the God of the Old Testament, which is by specific command. So why choose one over the other? Because one's newer, but one also is then less agreeable with the original, what we hear from God, Yahweh himself. And that's what I'm hoping I'm showing you as we go through this. But what Paul is trying to say simply doesn't add up to what we actually read. Now, I want to be fair. There are, especially in this particular section, the ethical and moral laws that I've grouped together, these 50 commands that still make up a very small percentage of the overall 613, some good ones, even some good ones for seemingly strangers. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. Leviticus 19:34. I see it. I acknowledge that verse. I also acknowledge that it is in direct contrast with the other verses that I've just read you from the same book of the Bible. And if we were to really dig into this, and it's not the purpose of today's video, you could see that a stranger residing among you has already been included into the Israelite community. Maybe it's someone you're trading or bartering with, and there's rules about how to treat them. It doesn't mean you can't go next door to this nation and still buy people as property. There's nuance here, just like how these rules on kidnapping that people try to say, oh, that shows God was against slavery. You can't have slaves without kidnapping. No, you can have a loophole though. If someone else has already inherited a slave, or if a person who's already a slave gives birth, this person can still also be a slave from birth, then you're not kidnapping them. It's not kidnapping if you purchase a piece of property. And so this is what I mean is the cherry picking that the atheist typically gets accused of is something we see Paul doing. And look at the ones he listed out of the 613. He had access. He knew that Torah better than anybody. And he chose the easy ones like murder and theft because he knew if he listed some of these others, he couldn't make a case that it's all summarized by love. So again, I acknowledge good verses exist, but there's nuance to them. And even if they existed in their own right and it actually meant what it said, it wouldn't get away from all the other horrendous things. This is what's so funny. I'll list a verse that is clearly immoral, clearly a big problem, and a Christian's defense to it most of the time seems to be to comment back to me a verse that says the opposite. I'm sorry, do you not see the issue with this? At best, you're just saying, hey, there's a contradiction. Yeah, I've got a problem with contradictions. You should too, by the way. Most of the time, though, it's because they haven't read their context around their verse that they think is actually against the verse I'm saying. Like when they throw a kidnapping verse at me when I'm talking about slavery. And furthermore, they seem to think that they equal out or that we should only look at the positive one. That's not how it works. It's so simple to me. I don't understand why. I mean, I do understand why. I've been there. I understand what indoctrination will do to you. I understand what a personal relationship that you think you have, why that supersedes some silly Old Testament law, especially when Paul is giving you a get out of jail free card with, hey, it's all about loving your neighbor anyways. But come on, can we really care about what this God that you say you love and adore and obey said? Dig into these laws. But let's move on to the next one, which is 80 commandments all around family and sexual laws. There's some good ones here. Honor your father and your mother. That's even one of the 10 commandments. If you read the rest of that verse, though, it's so that you may live a long life, because to dishonor your father and your mother meant you could be stoned to death. This is what I mean. Even some of the most simple, pretty basic ones that we all love to quote are filled with baggage and immorality. Marriage laws. Hey, marriage is a good thing, right? This should be fine. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, he writes her a certificate of divorce. Notice the woman doesn't have the same rights to do this to the man, and this is very vague for whatever indecency the man can find in the woman. Kind of sounds like a patriarchal society that wanted to give themselves an out if they no longer liked their woman, but didn't want to give women the same right. Again, seems a lot like a man-made concept of the time and place, and not so much like a perfect, all-knowing, foreknowing, loving God. Oh, here's a good one. You know, we have a law on rape. This is great. We need more of this. Let's read it. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, he shall give the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver. Oh, shoot. That didn't go the direction I was hoping. So if you meet a non-engaged virgin and you seize her, which, by the way, is not said to be illegal here. There's not a law against rape. There's a law against taking another man's property and devaluing it. And how you fix that is by making up for the value lost, paying 50 shekels. This is how your God that you love, that you pray over your young daughters and want them to love and adore, thinks of women. Show me how this is loving God or loving your neighbor. This is one man writing a code that makes sure that he knows that if his daughter gets raped before he can sell her off to another man, he's going to be fairly compensated. That's what this law is for. 100%, make no doubt about it, and nothing more. No love, no care for the unity or the sanctity of marriage, no care for the issues of that poor young virginal woman who is being traumatized for life, who is having her value removed from her in that society forever, who is being physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually broken. None of that matters. Make it right with the dad. Let's just forget what happens to this woman. Tell me this is a good God. Tell me that loving your neighbor summarizes this. Well, it does if you're trying to make sure that your neighbor, a man, a landowning man at the time who wanted to sell his daughter for a hefty price and no longer can, is taken care of financially, then sure, it's loving your neighbor. Is that what we're going for? Is that going to make this good to you? Group 6 here, agriculture and economic laws. There's 78 of these. This is where we get, again, that example of the prohibition of interest. Yay. We get the first fruits law here, the gleaning laws, the jubilee year, the prohibition of mixing seeds, really important stuff. We didn't outlaw rape, but we'll say you shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. And moving on quickly because those get redundant are the miscellaneous laws. These are 90 commands that I don't know where to place. You've got things on clothing. You shall not wear cloth of wool and linen mixed together. Or telling the Israelites to make tassels on the corners of their garments. Or one that I really love, the prohibition against sorcery. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. An acknowledgement here that, and again, this is before we have the concept of devils or demons. All we had at this point in the Old Testament is the accuser, who seemed, for all intents and purposes, to be an agent of God himself, which means you can't just say, oh, these were demonic forces working in the world. How God himself, who wrote this law, saw the world was one filled with magic. Necromancers, sorcerers, witches, fortune tellers. These all existed in reality to the God of the Old Testament. And he didn't like it. Put them to death. I'm the only special power around. Is it loving your neighbor to put a sorceress to death? Maybe. Not if that neighbor is the sorceress. And that gets into the moral subjectivity of it all, which is a hilarious statement to talk about when we're talking about God's objective moral law. There is nothing in this law that supersedes the time or place, which is, again, what we would expect of something written by man, not of God. And so, in summary, should we trust Paul, where we get our entire identity as Christians today? I think not. I think we can see him abusing the Old Testament multiple times in multiple ways to reach a people group that wasn't Jewish, that didn't want to circumcise themselves, that didn't want to worry about what they had to eat. How do you make this religion appealing to them? Simple. Remove the parts of it they don't like. Another win for objective morality and an immutable God. He's changing, retconning the religion at its pre-established foundation to make it more accessible and appealing to a newer audience. So that would be a main thing that I'd want to communicate to you through this video, is just understanding how the religion transformed and why. How it's much more likely that it was for these kinds of reasons than it was some perfect plan from God from day one before time existed about how he would bring Jesus to be the fruition of the law that man could never uphold. No, which leads us to the other things I'm hoping you get from this. Seeing God for who he was, for who he supposedly will always be. Look at these commands. Look at how much they fail. Look at where they fall short. Look at where they're incomplete. Look at where they're unfair. Look at where they're sexist. Look at where they're racist. Look at where they only benefit certain kinds of people at certain times. And tell me this is from a God that you say loves you personally, millennia later, as a Gentile, as a female, as a homosexual, as insert anything other than a property-owning male Jew. And I'll show you exactly why you're wrong. And that's it. Let me know what you think. Let me know which laws make you think that I'm correct or that I'm totally wrong or why. But I'm going to ask you, especially if you're a Christian who's going to say something to the opposite of my effect, that if you use a verse to tell me why I'm wrong without addressing all the verses I used to first share the issue, just know it does nothing for the argument. You're just showing that there's an incompatible part of the Bible that says something good. Most of the time, probably not. Check your context. Let's deal with the issues I raised in this video. Quoting John 3:16 at me doesn't solve it. Looking forward to everyone's feedback. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you Tuesday with another takedown. Thursday, we're back at Secular Bible Study Series with Galatians, which this is Paul's angriest letter. Stick around. You're not going to want to miss it. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Kitboga, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, Jarrod, Kristi, YNWA, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Maggie, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.